You're nothing. That's what he whispered in her ear, at a gala, in front of 700 people, his mistress on his arm, his mother laughing behind her, his sister filming it for Instagram. He had just promoted his girlfriend to vice president, in her company, with her money, on a stage she built, and she sat there, quiet, in a simple black dress, holding a leather journal, looking like nobody. But here's what nobody in that room knew. She founded that company at 22 years old, in a dorm room, with $47 in her bank account. She wrote the algorithm. She filed every patent. She built the entire $65 billion empire from nothing, while her husband slept, stole $4.2 million, and told investors he was the genius behind it all. He never read the paperwork. He never checked who actually owned the company. He never once asked himself why his quiet wife always sat in the back row of every board meeting. He should have. Because tonight, she's taking everything back. And what happens next, nobody in that room saw coming. Not him, not his mistress, not his mother, and definitely not the rival CEO who thought he was buying her company out from under her. This is the story of a woman who was invisible for 10 years. Not because she was weak, because she was waiting. Stay with me until the end, because the moment she finally speaks, you will never forget it. Lesson and value. Before we begin, I want you to know something. This story is not just entertainment. It carries a truth that millions of women live every single day. Your silence is not weakness. Your patience is not surrender. And your worth is not determined by who notices you. It is determined by what you build when nobody is watching. If you have ever felt invisible, if someone has ever taken credit for your work, if you have ever been told you are nothing by someone who would be nothing without you, this story is for you. If this story touched something inside you, if it made you feel seen, heard, or reminded you of your own strength, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment. Tell me your story. Tell me about the moment you decided to stop being invisible. And if you know a woman who needs to hear this tonight, share this video with her. Sometimes a story is the thing that finally gives someone permission to stand up, subscribe, turn on notifications, because the next story we are bringing you is even more powerful than this one. The fluorescent lights in the emergency room waiting area buzzed like trapped insects, casting everything in a pale, sickly glow that made the world feel like it was ending. And for Amani Cole Sterling, sitting alone in a plastic chair at 2:17 in the morning, it might as well have been. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. Not dramatically, not like in the movies where the heroine rips her gown in some act of defiance. No. This was the kind of a tear that happens when you grab your child and run. When your hands are shaking so badly that fabric catches on a door handle and you don't even notice because the only thing that matters is the small body in your arms. Mascara streaked down her cheeks in dark rivers she hadn't bothered to wipe away. In her lap, she held a stuffed rabbit, small, gray, missing one button eye, Zoe's favorite, the one she slept with every night. The one she named Professor Bunny because she said he looked smart. Amani's phone buzzed on the chair beside her. She didn't want to look. She already knew who it was. She picked it up anyway, the way you touch a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. A text from Terrence. "You brought this on yourself." 5 words. That's all he had to say. His daughter was in a hospital bed, and that was what her father sent. Not, "Is she okay?" Not, "I'm coming." Just blame, packaged in 5 words and delivered at 2 in the morning like it was a business memo. Imani stared at the message until the screen went dark. Then she set the phone face down and pressed Professor Bunny against her chest. breathing in the smell of lavender, detergent, and something sweeter underneath. Zoe's smell, the smell of her baby. A nurse appeared in the doorway. Young woman, kind eyes, the sort of face that had learned how to deliver hard news gently. Mrs. Sterling? Your daughter is asking for you. Amani stood. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Like she was borrowing a body that had forgotten how to work properly. She smoothed her torn dress, tucked the rabbit under her arm, and walked toward the room where her 7-year-old daughter was waiting. The hallway stretched longer than it should have. Each step echoed, and with each step, Amani's mind pulled backward, rewinding through the 48 hours that had brought her here. Through the gala and the lights and the gasps. Through the plan that was supposed to save everything. Through the betrayals she saw coming and the one she never did. 48 hours ago, Amani Cole Sterling had a plan. She was going to take back her company, expose her husband's lies, and walk away with her dignity and her daughter. She was going to prove that the quiet woman everyone ignored was the one who built everything. She had no idea that the people she trusted most were about to take it all away, including the one person she would die for. But to understand how Imani ended up in that hospital, holding a stuffed rabbit and reading cruel texts from the man who promised to love her forever, you have to go back. Not 48 hours. 2 months. To a morning that started with star-shaped pancakes and a question about superpowers. It was 6:32 on a Tuesday morning, and Amani was standing at the kitchen island of a 12,000-square-foot house that she owned but no longer felt like hers. The marble countertops gleamed. The Viking range hummed with expensive efficiency. Everything in this kitchen cost more than the house she grew up in, and none of it felt like home. But the pancakes were hers. She poured batter into a star-shaped mold, watching it sizzle and spread, because last Thursday Zoe had mentioned, just once, casually, between bites of cereal, that she wished pancakes came in shapes. Most parents would have forgotten. Amani never forgot anything her daughter said. It was a habit she'd developed after years of being forgotten herself. Her leather journal sat open on the counter beside the stove. Brown, worn soft at the edges, her initials pressed into the bottom corner, in gold that had faded to almost nothing. She scribbled a note between flipping pancakes. Numbers, calculations, things that would have made the chief financial officer of a $65 billion company nervous if the chief financial officer had any idea what his wife was actually doing at 6 in the morning. Zoe appeared in the kitchen doorway like a small tornado that had decided to take human form, pajamas covered in cartoon planets, hair going in 7 different directions, gap-toothed grin that could power a city. Mommy? She climbed onto a bar stool with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted she was welcome anywhere. If you could have any superpower, what would it be? Amani considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything her daughter asked. Invisibility. Zoe's face scrunched up. That's a sad superpower, Mommy. Amani set a plate of star-shaped pancakes in front of her daughter, leaned down, and kissed her forehead. Not if you use it right, baby. Zoe shrugged with the easy philosophy of a 7-year-old and attacked a pancake star with her fork. She didn't know that her mother had been invisible for 10 years. She didn't know that the company name on the building where Daddy worked actually belonged to the woman making her breakfast. She didn't know any of it. And Amani intended to keep it that way for as long as possible. Terrence came downstairs at 6:45, moving through the kitchen like a man walking through a hotel lobby. Expensive suit, phone in hand, eyes on the screen. He picked up a piece of toast from the counter without looking at it, or at the woman who made it, or at the daughter who was trying to show him the drawing she'd brought home from school. "Daddy, look what I made. It's our family. See? That's you, and that's Mommy, and that's me, and that's Professor Bunny." Terrence glanced up for half a second. "That's great, sweetheart. Daddy's busy." Zoe's smile dimmed. Not all the way. Children are resilient like that. But enough. Enough for Amani to see it. Enough for something behind Amani's eyes to harden into something that looked like patience, but was actually a decision being made in real time. Lorraine Sterling entered the kitchen next, and the temperature dropped 3 degrees. Terrence's mother moved through life like a woman who believed the world owed her a standing ovation for existing. She was 64 years old, impeccably dressed at all times, and had been living in Amani's house for 8 years without once acknowledging whose name was on the mortgage. She surveyed the breakfast spread, picked up one of Zoe's star pancakes between 2 fingers like it was evidence at a crime scene, examined it, and set it back down. "Imani, sweetie." The word "weedy" in Lorraine's mouth was a weapon disguised as affection. "I've been meaning to talk to you. Terrence has that investor dinner Friday night. I told Bianca she could join since she handles operations now. You don't mind staying home with Zoe, do you? It's just..." She paused, selecting her next words with the precision of a surgeon choosing a scalpel. These dinners require a certain energy. Amani didn't look up from the stove. "Of course, Lorraine. Shanice?" Terrence's 28-year-old sister walked through the kitchen with her phone held at arm's length, recording everything for her Instagram story. She had moved in 6 months after Lorraine, and between the two of them, they had turned Imani's home into a place where she felt like a guest. "Honestly, it's better this way," Shanice said, angling her phone to catch her own face in better light. "Last time you came to one of these things, that investor's wife asked if you were the caterer." She laughed. Lorraine pressed her lips together to suppress a smirk. Terrence said nothing. He was already walking toward the garage, toast in one hand, phone in the other, existing in a world where his wife's humiliation was just background noise. Amani said nothing. She just wiped the counter with a dish towel, her movements calm and measured. But under the counter, where nobody could see, her hand gripped the marble edge so hard her knuckles turned white. Zoe, still eating her pancakes, looked at her mother with those enormous brown eyes. "Mommy, what's a caterer?" Amani smiled. "Someone who makes food for parties, baby." "Oh." Zoe thought about this. "Well, your food is really good, so that's kind of a compliment." And just like that, in the way only children can, Zoe made the world slightly more bearable. Amani kissed her daughter's head and started cleaning up the kitchen. In 8 hours, she would sit in a board meeting and watch her husband take credit for work she did at 3 in the morning. In 12 hours, she would eat dinner at a table where 3 people treated her like furniture. In 24 hours, she would write in her journal the same thing she'd written every night for the past 6 months. Not yet, but soon. Sterling Global Innovations occupied a 42-story glass tower in Midtown Atlanta that caught the morning sun and threw it back at the city like a challenge. The lobby alone was worth more than most companies. All polished marble, and abstract art, and a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. Every morning, 1,200 employees walked through those doors feeling like they were a part of something important. And every morning, Amani Cole Sterling parked in the regular garage, not the executive level, took the regular elevator, not the express, and walked to a small office on the 4th floor that had her name on a placard that read, "Administrative Support." Most people in the building had no idea who she was. The ones who did know her name knew her only as Terrence Sterling's wife, the quiet one. the one who showed up to events looking uncomfortable and disappeared before dessert, the one who sat in the back of board meetings with a notebook, presumably taking minutes, presumably doing whatever it is that administrative support people do. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wondered why the CEO's wife had an office on the fourth floor instead of the executive suite on 42. Nobody asked because nobody cared. She was invisible, and in a company this size, invisible people are the ones who keep the lights on while everyone else takes credit for the electricity. This morning, like every morning, Amani settled into her small office with its one window and its view of the parking garage. She opened her laptop, pulled up files that no one in this building knew she had access to, and began reviewing the quarterly numbers that Terrence would present to the board in 2 hours as if he'd calculated them himself. He hadn't, of course. Terrence Sterling could barely read a balance sheet without someone explaining it to him, but he could read a room. He could smile at the right moment, pause for effect, drop buzzwords like synergy and disruption with the confidence of a man who believed his own mythology. And that, in the world of corporate America, was often enough. The board meeting started at 10. Imani took her usual seat in the back row, leather journal in her lap, pen in hand. She wore a simple blouse and slacks, no jewelry except her wedding band, which she kept meaning to stop wearing but hadn't yet, for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. Terrence stood at the head of the conference table like a man addressing his kingdom. 12 board members sat around the table, including Helen Calloway, the chairwoman, a 71-year-old woman with silver hair and the kind of eyes that had been watching people make fools of themselves in boardrooms for 4 decades. Helen was the only person in that room who knew the truth, the only one who knew that the woman in the back row wasn't taking minutes. She was auditing everything. Our supply chain algorithm, Terrence was saying, pointing to a slide that Imani had designed at 3 in the morning, predicted the semiconductor shortage 6 months before anyone else in the industry. That's the kind of forward thinking I've built into this company's DNA. Imani wrote something in her journal. Her face betrayed nothing. A young employee named Jason, maybe 25, sitting along the wall as an observer from the analytics department, leaned toward his colleague and whispered, "Who's the woman in the back? She's at every one of these meetings." His colleague, a woman named Danielle, who'd been at Sterling Global for 7 years, shrugged. "Terrence's wife. She's like an assistant or something. Nobody really knows what she does." Jason looked at Imani again. She was watching Terrence with an expression he couldn't quite read. "She looks like she's about to say something." Danielle shook her head. "She never does." After the meeting, Imani gathered her things and walked to the elevator. She pressed the down button and waited, standing perfectly still in the way she'd mastered over the years. The way that made people's eyes slide right past her, like she was part of the wallpaper. The elevator arrived. The doors opened. And there, inside, was Bianca Hayes. Bianca was 33 years old, and she moved through the world like a woman who had been told she was exceptional so many times that she'd stopped questioning it. She wore a fitted dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, heels that could double as weapons, and a smile that was 90% performance and 10% genuine amusement at how easy everything seemed to be. She'd been at Sterling Global for 2 years. In that time, she'd risen from a senior director to the head of a department to Terrence's most trusted advisor. She'd also risen from a professional acquaintance to a dinner companion to the woman Terrence was sleeping with in a downtown apartment he thought nobody knew about. Imani knew about the apartment. She knew the address, the lease terms, and the fact that Terrence was paying for it with a company credit card that he'd listed under client entertainment. But she didn't know all of this because she was weak or passive or sad. She knew because she'd hired someone to find out. A private investigator named Russell Combs, who specialized in corporate infidelity and who had, over the past 11 months, compiled a file thicker than most novels. Bianca held the elevator door and smiled, the kind of smile that a cat gives a mouse when they both know the cat has already won. "Oh, Imani, right? Terrence's wife. I keep forgetting you work here." She tilted her head slightly, performing confusion. "What floor are you on?" Again?" "Fourth," Imani said. Bianca's eyebrows rose a fraction. "Huh. I didn't even know we had a fourth floor." The doors opened on the executive level. Bianca stepped out, her heels clicking on the marble like a countdown. She didn't look back. Imani stayed in the elevator as the doors closed. She stood there for a moment, alone in the humming metal box, and whispered two words so quietly that only she could hear them. "You will." Back in her fourth-floor office, Imani opened her journal to a page filled with dense, careful handwriting. Not meeting minutes, not grocery lists, strategic notes, legal citations, financial calculations that would make the board's heads spin if they ever saw them. She flipped to a section near the back where she kept a different kind of record. Dates, locations, times, a meticulous log of every time Terrence and Bianca had been seen together outside of work. Hotel check-ins matched with company credit card statements, restaurant receipts from places Terrence told Imani he'd never been. Photographs, printed small and tucked between the pages, showing two people who thought they were being discreet and weren't. Imani closed the journal and looked out from her window at the parking garage. Somewhere up on the 42nd floor, her husband was sitting in her office, running her company, taking credit for her work, and sleeping with a woman he'd promoted with her money. And Imani sat here, on the fourth floor, in a room nobody knew existed, and waited, because waiting was what she did best. It was what her mother had taught her, back on a porch in rural Georgia, back when the world was small enough to fit in a leather journal and a promise. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Webb, her oldest friend and the only attorney she trusted. Marcus had been her roommate's boyfriend's best friend at MIT, and through a series of late-night study sessions and shared pizzas, he'd become the closest thing Imani had to a brother. The text read, "Lunch? I found something you need to see. Also, I'm buying because you technically own the restaurant we usually go to, and that's a conflict of interest." Imani almost smiled. Almost. She texted back, 12:30, and I don't own the restaurant. Marcus replied, "You own the building it's in. Same thing. See you there." Imani put her phone away, straightened the papers on her desk, and went back to being invisible. In 6 weeks, Sterling Global would celebrate its 15th anniversary with a gala at the Grand Meridian Hotel. In 6 weeks, 700 people would gather in a ballroom to toast the man they believed had built an empire. In 6 weeks, everything would change, but Imani didn't know that yet. She didn't know about the catastrophes that were coming, the betrayals she couldn't predict. The night she'd end up on a hospital floor, holding her daughter's stuffed rabbit, and wondering if she'd lost everything. All she knew, sitting in her small office on the fourth floor of a building she owned, was that she was tired of being invisible, and that somewhere in the pages of her mother's journal, between the dreams and the numbers and the evidence, there was a plan waiting to be born. She just needed one more push. She'd get it tonight. At 12:30, Imani sat across from Marcus Webb at a corner booth in a restaurant that was busy enough to provide cover and quiet enough to have a real conversation. Marcus was 40 years old, built like a former college basketball player who'd traded the court for a courtroom, and had the kind of face that looked serious until he opened his mouth and said something that made you snort coffee through your nose. He slid a manila folder across the table before she'd even ordered. "Good afternoon to you too," Amani said. "Pleasantries are for people who aren't sitting on a ticking time bomb. Open it." Amani opened the folder. Inside were bank statements, wire transfers, account numbers she didn't recognize. She scanned the pages, her eyes moving the way they did when she was processing data, quick, precise, connecting patterns that most people would need a spreadsheet to see. "These are company accounts," she said. "Yep. Terrence has been moving money, $4.2 million over the past 3 years, into a private account in his name only, routed through a shell company registered in Delaware that he set up using a personal email address, not his corporate one. The man is not exactly a criminal mastermind." Amani sat back in the booth. $4.2 million, stolen from the company she built, the company she coded in a dorm room at 22 years old, the company she named after her mother's silver bracelet. "This is embezzlement," she said. "This is a federal crime," Marcus corrected. "And it gives you something you didn't have before: leverage." Amani stared at the numbers. She should have felt angry. She should have felt betrayed. But the truth was, she felt tired, the kind of tired that settles into your bones after years of watching someone take everything you've given them and ask for more. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I started digging 2 months ago when his spending patterns changed. He bought a car last spring that isn't on any company asset list, paid cash, $212,000 for a vehicle that a man making his official salary could not afford unless he was either very lucky at poker or very stupid about crime. He doesn't play poker. Then we know which option it is." Amani closed the folder. "I'm not ready to use this yet." Marcus leaned forward. "Amani, the man is stealing from you. From your company. The company you built while he was selling copier leases in a strip mall office. I know what he was doing when I met him, Marcus." "Do you? Because sometimes I think you've rewritten history so many times in your head that you've forgotten you were already a millionaire when that man walked up to you at a networking event and asked about your book." Amani was quiet for a moment. Marcus was right. He was always right about Terrence. He'd been right from the very first night when he'd sent that text. That man's smile has "I will ruin your life" written all over it. "I need to tell you something," Marcus said, his tone shifting from sharp to careful. "And I need you to hear all of it before you react. That's never a good opening. Helen Calloway called me yesterday. She's worried. There's been activity on the board level that she can't explain. 3 members have been taking meetings that aren't on the official calendar. Off-site, with people from outside the company." Amani's stomach tightened. "Who?" "She doesn't know yet, but she thinks someone is building a coalition, either for a leadership challenge or something bigger." "Something bigger like what?" Marcus held her gaze, like a hostile takeover. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. A hostile takeover. Someone was trying to buy her company. The company she built from nothing. The company that was worth $65 billion because of an algorithm she wrote in a dorm room when she was too young to legally drink. "I need more information," Amani said. "I know, I'm working on it. But Amani, you need to understand something. If someone is really making a play for Sterling Global, your little plan to reveal yourself at the anniversary gala might not be enough. You might need to move faster. Or I might need to be more patient." Marcus sighed. "You and your mother. Patience this, quiet strength that. At some point, patience stops being a virtue and starts being a liability." Amani looked at him, and something in her expression made him stop talking. It was the look she got when she was about to say something that came from a place deeper than strategy, deeper than anger, from the place where her mother's voice still lived. "My mama mopped floors for 23 years. Amani said quietly. She mopped floors at the elementary school where I went to class. She mopped the gym floor after basketball games. She mopped the cafeteria at midnight so it would be clean when we came in for breakfast the next morning. And not once, not one single time, did anyone at that school ask her name. Marcus was silent. She put me through every after-school program, every science camp, every coding workshop she could find. She worked 3 jobs to make sure I had a laptop that actually worked. And when I got into MIT on a full scholarship, she cried for 2 hours straight, and then she went to work the night shift because the bills don't care about your feelings. Amani's voice didn't waver. It never did when she talked about her mother. It got quieter, which was somehow worse. She gave me a journal the night before I left for college, brown leather, my initials on the corner. She said, "Write your dreams here, baby. Every single one. And one day, you're going to look back at this book and laugh at how small you were dreaming." She paused. Mama D died when I was 26. Cancer. The kind that starts quiet and moves fast. She died 3 weeks before Sterling Global hit $1 million in revenue. 3 weeks. She never saw it, never saw the building, never saw her daughter's name on a patent, never got to stop mopping floors. Amani looked at the folder on the table. $4.2 million, stolen by a man who'd never built anything in his life. So when you tell me to move faster, Marcus, I hear you. But I'm going to do this my way, the way she taught me. Quiet, thorough. And when I finally move, there won't be a single person in that room who can pretend they didn't see me. Marcus sat back. He picked up his water glass, took a long drink, and set it down. Your mother would be terrifying if she were alive, you know that? Where do you think I got it from? He almost smiled. Fine, we do it your way, but I'm keeping this folder ready, and I'm updating the file I started in 2019. What file? Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick binder with a handwritten label on the spine. It read, "I told you so." Amani stared at it. You did not. I absolutely did. It's got tabs, color-coded. The red section is the affair. Blue is financial fraud. Green is his mother's property damage to your kitchen during her unauthorized renovation in 2021. There's also a yellow section, but that's just screenshots of his terrible tweets that I saved for personal entertainment. Despite everything, despite the stolen money and the hostile takeover and the 10 years of being treated like furniture in her own house, Amani laughed. It was short and surprised, like a bird startled into flight, but it was real. You're insane, she said. I'm prepared. There's a difference. And you're buying lunch because this emotional support is not covered by my retainer. They ordered, they ate, they planned, and by the time Amani drove back to Sterling Global that afternoon, she had the beginnings of something that felt dangerous and necessary and long overdue. A plan, not revenge. She kept telling herself that. This wasn't about hurting Terrence. It was about reclaiming what was hers. Her company, her name, her daughter's future. But if Terrence got hurt in the process, well, he should have read the paperwork. 3 weeks later, Amani stood in front of her closet and made a decision that would cost her more than she could have imagined. Sterling Global was hosting its annual charity gala, a smaller event than the upcoming 15th anniversary, but still a production. 400 guests, open bar, a live band playing songs that nobody really liked, but everyone pretended to enjoy. Amani had decided to go. Not because she wanted to, not because she enjoyed watching her husband charm rooms full of people who didn't know she existed. She went because Marcus had told her to start being visible again, to plant seeds, to let people see her face before the big reveal at the anniversary gala 6 weeks away. And she went because, in a moment of weakness she'd later regret, she asked Lorraine for advice. Wear blue. Lorraine had said over dinner the night before, not looking up from her phone. It's Terrence's favorite color. Shows you're still making an effort. Amani should have heard the trap in those words. Should have recognized the sweetness in Lorraine's voice as the same sweetness a spider puts in its web. But she was tired, and sometimes when you're tired, you mistake cruelty for kindness, because believing in kindness is easier than accepting that the people in your house want to see you fail. She bought a blue dress, not expensive, not flashy, a simple, elegant blue that made her dark skin glow and her eyes look like they were holding secrets. She felt good in it. That should have been the warning sign. Feeling good in the Sterling house was usually the setup for something terrible. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom was full by the time Amani arrived with Zoe. The babysitter had canceled last minute, a coincidence that Amani would later learn was not a coincidence at all. Shanice had called the babysitter and told her the event was rescheduled. So Zoe came, 7 years old, wearing a purple dress with sequins that she'd picked out herself, holding Professor Bunny in one hand and her mother's hand in the other. They walked in, and for a moment, Amani felt almost normal. The room was beautiful. The music was soft. Zoe's eyes were wide with wonder. And then Imani saw Bianca Hayes walk through the main entrance and the world tilted sideways. Bianca was wearing blue, the exact same shade, the exact same designer. The dress was nearly identical to Imani's, except it fit Bianca like it had been sewn onto her body by angels with a grudge. She looked like a magazine cover. She looked like she'd been told what Imani would be wearing and had chosen to wear it better, because she had. Across the room, Lorraine caught Imani's eye and smiled, not a warm smile, a satisfied one, the smile of a woman who had set a trap and watched it snap shut. Shanice stood beside her mother, phone already up, already recording, already composing the caption she'd post later with a crying, laughing emoji. Amani felt the blood drain from her face. She understood now. The advice, the blue. It was never about helping her. It was about making sure that when Bianca walked in wearing the same color, everyone would compare them, and everyone would decide that Bianca won. Zoe tugged her hand. "Mommy, that lady is wearing your color." "I see that, baby. She doesn't look as pretty as you, though." Amani squeezed her daughter's hand and guided her to a table near the back. She sat down. She straightened Zoe's sequined dress. She poured herself a glass of water with a hand that trembled only slightly, and she waited for the evening to get worse. It did. Terrence took the stage an hour later. He was magnetic up there, Imani had to admit. Whatever else he was, whatever lies he told, and money he stole, and vows he broke, the man could command a room. He had that gift. The ability to make everyone feel like he was talking directly to them, like they were the only person who mattered. "I want to take a moment," Terrence said into the microphone, "to thank the person who inspires me every single day to push harder, dream bigger, and never settle for anything less than extraordinary." Amani felt Zoe look up at her expectantly, waiting for Daddy to say Mommy's name. Terrence looked directly at Bianca. Bianca Hayes. This company wouldn't be where it is without your vision and your dedication. The room applauded. Bianca pressed her hand to her chest in a performance of humility that deserved an award. Terrence beamed at her with an expression that was definitely not professional admiration. A woman at the next table leaned to her companion and whispered loudly enough for Amani to hear. "Oh my God, his wife is right there." Her companion whispered back, "I heard she doesn't really do anything. He built the whole company himself." Zoe's small voice cut through the noise like a knife. "Mommy, why did Daddy say that lady's name instead of yours?" And there it was. The question that broke something inside Amani that she'd been holding together with willpower and habit and the desperate hope that things would get better on their own. She couldn't answer. Not honestly, not in a way that a 7-year-old could understand. So she did what mothers do when they're falling apart. She smiled. "Let's go get some cake, baby." She walked her daughter out of the ballroom, down a hallway that smelled like expensive flowers, and into a bathroom with marble sinks and soft lighting. She locked the door. She set Zoe on the counter. She found a plate of petit fours that someone had left on a tray near the mirror. "These are fancy," Zoe said, inspecting a small chocolate cake with the seriousness of a food critic. "Very fancy," Amani agreed. Her voice was steady. Her eyes were not. Zoe ate cake. Professor Bunny sat beside her, on the counter, keeping watch, and Amani stood in front of the mirror, tears rolling silently down her cheeks, looking at herself in a blue dress that someone had used as a weapon and made a decision. Not someday. Not when the time is right. Not when I'm ready. Now. I'm doing this now. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the first ring, like he'd been waiting. Like he always was. "I'm done," she said. "I want everything back." There was a pause. Then Marcus's voice, steady and sure, and carrying just a hint of something that sounded like relief. "Hallelujah. I've had the paperwork ready since 2019. The next 6 weeks were the most focused of Amani's life, and for a woman who'd built a $65 billion company from a dorm room, that was saying something. Marcus set up a war room in his downtown office. Not literally, although he did bring in a whiteboard and enough takeout containers to build a small fort. The plan had 3 parts, and each part had to work perfectly, or the whole thing would collapse. Part 1. The legal foundation. Marcus and a team of 4 attorneys reviewed every document related to Sterling Global's ownership structure. The original articles of incorporation signed by Imani at 22. The trust structure she'd created before marrying Terrence, placing all voting shares under a holding company she controlled entirely. The employment contracts that made Terrence's CFO title a gift she could revoke, not a right he'd earned. Terrence had signed every document Marcus put in front of him. He'd signed them the way he did everything that didn't involve a microphone or an audience, carelessly, without reading, because he assumed that being married to the founder was the same as being the founder. It wasn't. Part 2. The evidence. Russell Combs, the private investigator, delivered his final report. 11 months of documentation. Hotel check-ins cross-referenced with company credit card statements, photographs of Terrence and Bianca entering and leaving a downtown apartment, recorded phone calls that Imani couldn't listen to without feeling like the floor was dissolving beneath her, and the embezzlement. $4.2 million funneled through a Delaware shell company into Terrence's personal account. Marcus had every wire transfer, every authorization, every digital fingerprint. Part 3. The reveal. Helen Calloway, the board chairwoman, had been waiting for this moment longer than anyone knew. She'd watched Terrence take credit for Imani's work for a decade. She'd sat through board meetings where he presented strategies he didn't understand, using language he'd memorized from slides Imani created. Helen had stayed quiet because Imani asked her to, because Imani's way was patience. But Helen was 71 years old, and her patience had expiration dates. The anniversary gala, Helen said, during a secret meeting in Marcus's office, 700 people, every major investor, industry press, board members. If we're going to do this, we do it there. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. During the gala, after Terrence gave his inevitable self-congratulatory speech, the AV system would play a prepared presentation, photos of Imani building the company, the original patents with her name, the incorporation documents, the trust structure. Everything the world needed to see that Sterling Global belonged to one person, and it wasn't the man on the stage. Then Imani would take the microphone, announce her return as CEO, remove Terrence, terminate Bianca, and walk out. For 4 weeks, the plan came together like clockwork. The legal documents were airtight. The presentation was devastating. The board was aligned, all 12 members ready to vote in Imani's favor. Imani started changing at work. Small things, standing straighter in meetings, making eye contact with people who'd looked through her for years, arriving earlier, leaving later. Jason, the young analyst, mentioned it to Danielle at lunch. "Have you noticed something different about Terrence's wife?" Danielle looked up from her salad. "Different how?" "I don't know. She just seems more present, like she's paying attention to everything." "She's always been paying attention," Danielle said. "People just never noticed." Everything was perfect. The evidence was overwhelming. The legal team was ready. The board was aligned. Imani felt something she hadn't felt in 10 years. Power. Real power. The kind that comes from knowing the truth and being ready to use it. She felt safe. That was the mistake. 1 week before the gala. 7 days. Imani was at the office late, sitting in her fourth-floor office, finalizing the presentation timeline with Helen via encrypted email. She'd been working for 5 hours straight, and she needed to use the printer down the hall to review a hard copy of the speaking order. She left her laptop open. Just for 2 minutes, maybe 3, it was enough. Shanice Sterling had been coming to the office more frequently in the past month. Lorraine had sent her to check on things, which was Lorraine's way of saying spy on Imani without being obvious about it. Shanice wasn't obvious. She was clumsy. But clumsy people sometimes stumble into exactly the wrong place at exactly the wrong time. Shanice walked past Imani's office, glanced in through the open door, and saw the laptop screen. She didn't understand most of what was on it, the legal language, the corporate structure diagrams, the board voting procedures. But she understood one line, highlighted in yellow at the top of an email from Marcus Webb. Transfer of authority, removal of Terrence Sterling from all executive positions, effective date of anniversary gala. Shanice didn't hesitate. She pulled out her phone, photographed the screen, and sent the image to Lorraine with a single text. "You need to see this." Lorraine called Terrence. Terrence read the text during a dinner with investors, excused himself from the table, and called his wife. Imani answered. "Hello? Come home, now." He was waiting in the living room when she arrived, standing in front of the fireplace like a man who'd rehearsed this confrontation in his head and decided he was the hero of the story. "You think you can embarrass me?" His voice was low and controlled, which was more frightening than shouting would have been. "In my company? At my gala? In front of my investors?" Imani set her bag down. "It's not your company, Terrence." He laughed. The sound had no warmth in it. "Try proving that. My name is Sterling. My face is on every magazine cover. Every investor in this country knows my name. Who are you, Imani? You're the woman who answers phones on the 4th floor. You're the woman who sits in the back of meetings and writes in a journal like a college student. You're nobody." Imani felt the words land. She'd heard variations of them for 10 years, but somehow, hearing them from the man she'd given everything to, in the house she'd bought, in the life she'd built, they still hurt. Pain doesn't develop calluses, no matter what anyone tells you. It just finds new places to settle. Then Terrence said the thing that changed everything. "And if you try anything at that gala, anything at all, I will take Zoe." The room went very still. I've already spoken with an attorney, a very good one. She specializes in custody cases, and she's confident that a judge will see things my way when I present evidence that you've been mentally unstable, delusional about your role at the company, neglectful as a mother. My mother will testify, my sister will testify, Bianca will testify. He stepped closer. You want to play chess with me, Imani? Fine, but I'll take your queen. Zoe. He was threatening to take Zoe, the child she'd carried for 9 months and delivered during a snowstorm, the child she made star-shaped pancakes for at 6:30 in the morning, the child who thought Professor Bunny was real and that her mother had a sad superpower. Imani didn't cry, she didn't scream, she stood there and felt something inside her rearrange itself, like tectonic plates shifting before an earthquake. The pain was still there. But underneath it, something else was forming, something harder, something that didn't flinch. She picked up her bag. Good night, Terrence. That's it? That's all you have to say? She looked at him, really looked at him, at the man she'd loved enough to give everything, the man who'd taken it all and come back for the one thing she'd die to protect. That's all I need to say. She walked upstairs, checked on Zoe, who was asleep with Professor Bunny tucked under her chin, and went to her office. She closed the door. She sat on the floor, and she called Marcus. He knows. Marcus was silent for 3 seconds. How? Shanice. She saw my laptop. I told you to encrypt that screensaver. I literally sent you instructions with diagrams. Marcus, he's threatening to take Zoe. The jokes stopped. Marcus's voice went flat and professional, the voice he used in courtrooms when things were serious. Tell me everything he said, word for word. She told him. When she finished, there was a long pause. This changes the timeline, Marcus said. We might need to delay the gala reveal. No. Imani, if he files for custody before the gala, it complicates everything. A judge could issue a temporary order. You could lose access to Zoe while the case is pending. Then make sure he doesn't file before the gala. How am I supposed to do that? You're the one with the color-coded binder, Marcus. Figure it out. Another pause, then quietly. I'll figure it out. But Imani, when this is over, you and I are going to have a very long conversation about why you didn't encrypt your screensaver. Fine. And you're buying dinner. Fine. For a month. Good night, Marcus. She hung up and sat in the dark, listening to the house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, Zoe shifted in her sleep and murmured something about stars. Somewhere downstairs, Terrence was probably on the phone with Bianca, reassuring her that everything was under control. And Imani sat on the floor of her office, surrounded by the ruins of her perfect plan, and wondered for the first time if patience might not be enough. 3 days before the gala, Imani picked Zoe up from school at 3:15, the same time she always did, rain or shine, no exceptions. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Being there, being the face your child sees when the doors open and the backpack is heavy and the day was long. Zoe climbed into the car with a painting, wet, dripping slightly, magnificent in the way that only a 7-year-old's art can be. I painted our house, Mommy. See? That's the big window, and that's the garden, and that's Professor Bunny sitting on the roof because he wants to see the stars. It's beautiful, baby. We'll put it on the fridge. Can we put it in the living room, on the wall, like real art? Imani smiled. It is real art. They drove home. Zoe talked about her deshipta, about how Marcus in her class, not Marcus the lawyer, a different Marcus entirely, had tried to eat a crayon, and Mrs. Robinson had to give him a talk about what is and isn't food. Imani listened and laughed and felt, for 15 minutes, like the world was manageable. Then they pulled into the driveway, and there was a car Imani didn't recognize. A dark sedan. Professional. The kind of car that means someone important is inside your house without your permission. She left Zoe in the car for a moment. "Wait here, baby. I'll come get you in 1 second." She walked inside, and her blood went cold. In the living room sat Terrence, wearing concern like a costume. Lorraine perched on the edge of the sofa with her hands clasped, looking like a woman who'd been rehearsing sympathy all afternoon. A woman in a gray suit, a family court attorney, and beside her, a social worker named Dr. Ellen Patterson, who had a clipboard and a gentle expression that meant she was about to ask questions that could change the rest of Imani's life. "Imani," Terrence said, standing. His voice was warm, caring, completely fake. "This is Dr. Patterson. She's here to do a routine home evaluation. I've expressed some concerns about Zoe's living environment, and I wanted to make sure we're doing everything we can to support our daughter." Every word was calculated. Every syllable was designed for the social worker's clipboard. He wasn't talking to Imani. He was performing for an audience of one, and that audience had the power to recommend whether a mother kept her child. The social worker smiled kindly. "Mrs. Sterling, this is nothing to be alarmed about, just a standard assessment. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions?" Imani couldn't scream, couldn't cry, couldn't throw the vase on the side table at her husband's head, which is what every cell in her body was demanding she do. She had to stand there, composed and cooperative, because any display of emotion would become evidence. Any crack in her facade would be written on that clipboard as "Mother exhibited signs of instability." "Of course," Imani said. "Would you like some coffee?" The questions were routine on the surface and devastating underneath. "How many hours do you work? Who picks Zoe up from school? Does Zoe have a consistent bedtime routine? Are there any concerns about the child's emotional well-being?" And then Lorraine, right on cue, leaned forward with the perfectly practiced expression of a concerned grandmother. "I don't want to speak out of turn," she said, which was the way Lorraine always began sentences that were entirely out of turn. "But I have noticed that Imani works quite late. There have been nights when Zoe has been left with me until well past 9. And there was one instance where Imani forgot to pick Zoe Assad up from school entirely." A lie. A complete and total fabrication. Imani had never once been late to pick up Zoe, not once in 7 years. She had rearranged board meetings, canceled investor calls, rescheduled legal consultations. She had done everything short of stopping time to make sure she was standing at those school doors at 3:15 every single day. But Lorraine said it with such sincerity, such grandmotherly concern, that the social worker wrote it down. Shanice, who had been sitting in the corner pretending to scroll her phone, added her contribution. "I also have some text messages that show some pretty erratic behavior. Imani texting at odd hours, contradicting herself, seeming confused about scheduling." She held up her phone, showing screenshots that Imani knew immediately were fabricated, edited, taken out of context. But they looked real enough on a screen, and they would look real enough on a clipboard. Imani said nothing. She answered every question calmly. She smiled when appropriate. She offered Dr. Patterson a tour of the house and showed her Zoe's room, which was immaculate because Imani kept it that way. Not because she was performing, but because she loved her daughter, and taking care of her space was one of the ways she showed it. And then Zoe walked in. She'd gotten tired of waiting in the car and had come inside on her own, still holding her wet painting. She looked at the adults in the room, at her father's fake concern, at her grandmother's rehearsed worry, at the strange woman with the clipboard, and she said, in that clear, honest voice that children use when they haven't yet learned that truth is sometimes dangerous. "Mommy, are you in trouble?" "No, baby. Everything's fine." "Then why is everybody looking at you like that?" The room went silent. "Doctor." Patterson wrote something on her clipboard. Lorraine shifted uncomfortably. Terrence looked away. Amani knelt down and took her daughter's painting. "This is beautiful, sweetheart. Let's go hang it up, okay?" She took Zoe to the kitchen, hung the painting on the refrigerator with magnets, poured a glass of juice, made sure her daughter was settled and happy and oblivious to the war being fought in the next room. Then she excused herself, went upstairs to her bathroom, locked the door, sat on the edge of the bathtub, and pressed her fists against her eyes until the urge to scream passed. Later that night, after Dr. Patterson had left and Lorraine had retired to her room with the satisfaction of a woman who'd accomplished something terrible, Amani called Marcus. "I need you to fix this." Marcus had already been working 14 hours straight since Amani's first call about the custody threat. He hadn't slept. He'd consumed enough coffee to fuel a rocket launch, and he'd found something. "Terrence's custody attorney," Marcus said. "Her name is Margaret Dawson. Ring any bells?" "No." "It should." 3 years ago, Margaret Dawson represented a company called Tech Bridge Solutions during their acquisition by Sterling Global. During that acquisition, she had access to confidential Sterling Global financial documents. As part of due diligence, Amani's mind clicked into gear. "That's a conflict of interest. That's a bar complaint waiting to happen. If Terrence uses her for the custody filing, we can challenge the entire case on grounds that his attorney had prior access to privileged corporate information that could influence custody proceedings. It won't just pause the case. It could get the whole thing thrown out." Amani exhaled. "What else?" "The embezzlement. 4.2 million. I've documented everything. If Terrence threatens custody, we counter with criminal charges. He goes to prison. He doesn't get custody. Simple math." "Is it that simple?" "Nothing is ever simple. But the threat is real enough to make him think twice. And thinking twice is all we need. We just need him to hesitate long enough to get through the gala." Amani sat in the dark, turning it over in her mind. The gala was in 3 days. If Terrence believed his custody threat had worked, if he believed Amani was too scared to act, he would relax. He'd let his guard down. He'd walk into that ballroom thinking he'd already won. "Can you file something that slows the custody process without tipping him off?" she asked. "Already drafted. I'll file it tomorrow morning. It'll look like a routine procedural motion. He won't know what it really does until it's too late." For the first time in days, Amani felt something other than fear. It wasn't hope, not exactly. It was the feeling you get when you've been falling for a long time and your hand finally catches a ledge. "Marcus? Yeah? Thank you. For the binder, for all of it." "Don't thank me yet. We're 3 days out and your husband just sent a social worker to your house. Save the gratitude for when we actually win." She almost smiled. "Fine, but when this is over, I'm framing that binder." "The 'I told you so' binder?" "It's going on the wall of whatever office I'm sitting in when I'm running my company again." "Now you're talking." The day before the gala arrived, carrying the weight of everything Amani had built and everything she was about to risk. She'd spent the morning in her usual routine. Star-shaped pancakes, Zoe's backpack check, the school drop-off where she held her daughter 3 seconds longer than normal, and hoped Zoe didn't notice. Zoe noticed anyway. "You're squishing me, Mommy." "Sorry, baby. I just love you a lot today." "You love me a lot every day." "You're right. I do." At 10:30, Amani drove to a law office on the north side of Atlanta where Helen Calloway was waiting. They'd been meeting here instead of at Sterling Global to avoid surveillance. Both the electronic kind and the Chinese kind, Helen was sitting behind a conference table covered in documents, her silver hair pulled back, reading glasses perched on the tip of her nose. She looked up when Imani walked in, and Imani knew immediately that something was wrong. Helen Calloway didn't fidget. Helen Calloway didn't avoid eye contact. Helen Calloway was the kind of woman who had stared down corporate raiders and congressional subcommittees without blinking. But right now, Helen Calloway was fidgeting, and she wasn't looking at Imani. "Sit down," Helen said. "I need to tell you something. That's the second time someone said that to me this month, and it hasn't gone well either time." Helen took off her reading glasses, folded them, set them on the table. With a precision that said she was buying time, Victor Ashford. The name landed in the room like a grenade. Victor Ashford was the CEO of Ashford Technologies, a $40 billion rival that had been circling Sterling Global for years the way a shark circles a boat that it thinks might be sinking. Victor was 62, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and ruthless in the way that only men who've never been told no can be. "He's been in negotiations with Terrence," Helen said, "for at least 4 months. A hostile takeover, structured as a merger to make it look friendly. Victor gets Sterling Global's patents and infrastructure. Terrence gets a golden parachute and a seat on the combined board. Everyone wins, except me, except you." Imani sat down. Her hands were steady, but something behind her ribs was doing things that hands couldn't. "It gets worse," Helen continued. "Victor didn't just approach Terrence, he approached board members, offered 3 of them positions on the merged company's board, with compensation packages worth $30 million each." "Which 3? Helen named them. Imani closed her eyes. These were people she'd personally vetted, people she'd put in those positions because she believed in their integrity. 2 of them had children who went to school with Zoe. Did they accept? 2 said yes immediately. The 3rd is still considering. I was approached as well. I said no. When? And there it was, the pause, the fidget, the thing Helen hadn't wanted to say. 2 weeks ago. The silence that followed was the kind that has texture, heavy and rough and impossible to swallow. 2 weeks, Imani said. "You've known for 2 weeks that my board was compromised, that there was a hostile takeover in progress, that my husband was selling my company to a rival, and you said nothing. I was trying to find a solution before bringing it to you. I didn't want to add to the pressure you were already under." "You didn't want to add to my pressure." Imani's voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which Helen knew from experience was far more dangerous. "Helen, the gala is tomorrow. My board is split. Terrence has a takeover partner. My custody case is hanging by a thread, and you waited 2 weeks because you didn't want to add to my pressure." Helen said nothing. There was nothing to say. She'd made a judgment call, and it had been wrong. Imani stood and walked to the window. Below, Atlanta traffic moved in its usual patterns, thousands of people going about their lives, unaware that a woman on the 14th floor of a law office was watching her world collapse in real time. She called Marcus, put him on speaker. "We have a problem," she explained. Marcus listened. When she finished, there was a long silence filled with the sound of Marcus doing math in his head. "If Victor files the acquisition papers before the gala," Marcus said, "we're looking at a legal battle that could take years. Your trust structure is rock solid, but with compromised board members, they can challenge it. They'll lose eventually, but eventually could mean 24 months of litigation." "And Zoe? If the company's tied up in legal proceedings, Terrence's lawyers use the instability to strengthen the custody argument. Unstable corporate environment, uncertain financial future, mother distracted by legal battles. So I lose the company and my daughter. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Helen spoke up. Amani, I know I've failed you, but the two board members who haven't yet voted with Victor, there might still be a way to bring them back. And the third? I don't know. But I do know this. Victor Ashford is a businessman. He doesn't make emotional decisions. If we can give him a reason to question the deal, a financial reason, something that makes Terrence look like a liability instead of an asset, Victor will protect his own interests first. Amani turned from the window. The embezzlement. Helen nodded. If Victor finds out his partner has been stealing from the company he's trying to buy, he won't protect Terrence. He'll cut him loose. Marcus's voice came through the speaker. She's right. Victor can't afford to be associated with a criminal. It would tank his own stock price. Amani looked at Helen, at the documents on the table, at the window and the city beyond it, and the life she'd built and the people who were trying to take it. And then she looked at her watch. 32 hours until the gala. 32 hours to rebuild a plan from the ground up. I'm going to need both of you, Amani said, and I'm going to need you to trust me. What's the plan? Marcus asked. A new one. That night, after Zoe was asleep, Amani sat on the floor of her home office. Legal documents were spread everywhere. Her journal was open to a blank page. She'd been on the phone with Marcus for 3 hours, working through scenarios, testing strategies, looking for the move that nobody would see coming. But every scenario had a hole. Every strategy had a weakness. And the clock was ticking. She opened her mother's journal. The first page, Mama D's handwriting, careful and deliberate, the handwriting of a woman who'd left school in the 10th grade and taught herself to write beautifully because she believed beautiful things mattered. Write your dreams here, baby. Every single one. Amani turned to the last page she'd written on. The words she'd put there weeks ago, back when the plan was simple and the path was clear. It's time. But it wasn't time. Not anymore. The plan was destroyed. The board was compromised. Her husband had a hostile takeover partner, and a custody threat, and a mother who would perjure herself without blinking. For the first time in her adult life, Amani spoke to her mother out loud, not in her head, where the conversations usually happened. Out loud, to the empty room, to the ghost she carried everywhere. Mama, I don't know how to be quiet and strong right now. I just feel quiet and tired. I don't know if I can do this. No answer. There was never an answer. Just the house settling, and somewhere down the hall, Zoe shifting in her sleep. Amani fell asleep on the floor, surrounded by papers, still holding the journal. She woke at 4 a.m. to a small hand shaking her shoulder. Mommy, why are you sleeping on the floor? Zoe, pajamas with cartoon planets, Professor Bunny dangling from one hand, hair in 7 different directions, eyes wide and worried. I was just working late, baby. Zoe sat down beside her. She looked at the papers, at the laptop with its dead battery, at the journal, at her mother's tired face, and she said something that changed everything. Mommy, at school, Mrs. Robinson says, when a problem is too big, you break it into little pieces. Is your problem too big? Amani looked at her daughter, at this small, brilliant, brave person who saw the world in terms of solvable problems and star-shaped pancakes and a stuffed rabbit who lived on the roof to watch the stars. Yeah, baby, it's pretty big. Then break it into pieces, Mommy. You're the smartest person I know, even smarter than Mrs. Robinson, and she knows everything. And just like that, at 4 a.m, on the floor of an office, surrounded by the wreckage of a plan that had taken 6 weeks to build, Amani's 7-year-old daughter handed her the answer. Break it into pieces. She wasn't going to win everything at once. She wasn't going to beat Terrence and Victor and the compromised board and the custody threat in a single move. She was going to break the problem into pieces and solve each one separately. She hugged Zoe, tight. The kind of hug that says, you just saved your mother's life and you don't even know it. Then she called Marcus at 4:30. Wake up. I have a new plan. Marcus's voice was thick with sleep. Woman, it is 4 in the... Marcus, wake. Up. A pause. The sound of someone sitting upright in bed. I'm up. Talk to me. And she did. For 45 minutes, while Zoe fell back asleep on the office floor, with Professor Bunny tucked under her chin, Imani laid out a plan that was more elegant, more ruthless, and more completely Imani than anything she'd ever conceived. She wasn't going to fight Terrence's game. She was going to change the game entirely. The plan had 4 pieces. Imani had 18 hours to execute all of them. Piece 1. At 7 in the morning, while Terrence was still asleep and Lorraine was in the shower, Imani sat in her car in the Sterling Global parking garage and made a phone call to a number she'd gotten from Helen Calloway, Victor Ashford's personal cell. He answered on the 3rd ring. Who is this? Someone inside Sterling Global who has information you need. Victor's voice sharpened. He was a predator by nature, and the scent of information was better than blood. I'm listening, Berit. The man you're partnering with, Terrence Sterling, has been embezzling from the company. $4.2 million over 3 years, funneled through a shell company in Delaware. If you proceed with this acquisition, you're buying a company whose CFO is a criminal. I'd suggest your due diligence team takes a closer look before you announce anything publicly. And why would someone inside Sterling Global tell me this? Because some of us would rather see the truth come out than watch our company get sold to someone based on a lie. She hung up. 30 seconds. That's all it took to light the fuse. By 9:30, Victor's forensic accounting team had confirmed the embezzlement. By 11, Victor had called an emergency meeting with his own board. By noon, he'd made a decision that Imani had predicted with mathematical precision. He didn't cancel the deal. Canceling would mean admitting he'd been fooled, and Victor Ashford did not get fooled. Instead, he restructured the terms so that Terrence was cut out entirely. In Victor's new version of the deal, he would acquire Sterling Global directly, bypassing Terrence and dealing only with the board, which meant Victor was about to try to buy a company from board members who didn't actually have the authority to sell it. But he didn't know that yet, and by the time he found out, it would be too late. Piece 2. At 8:45, Marcus filed an emergency motion with the family court. The motion presented evidence that Margaret Dawson, Terrence's custody attorney, had a conflict of interest stemming from her previous representation of TechBridge Solutions during Sterling Global's acquisition. The motion requested an immediate stay on all custody proceedings pending judicial review. The judge reviewed the filing at 10:15. By 11, the stay was granted. The custody case was frozen. Terrence wouldn't find out until he called his lawyer that afternoon, and she told him she could no longer represent him. Piece 3. Imani met with the compromised board members. Not all at once, one at a time. 3 meetings, 3 conversations, each one lasting exactly 15 minutes. She didn't threaten, didn't beg, didn't appeal to their loyalty or their conscience, because she knew that loyalty and conscience had price tags, and Victor had already met them. Instead, she showed them the embezzlement evidence, the wire transfers, the account numbers, the shell company documents, and she said the same thing to each of them. Victor Ashford now knows that the man he's partnering with is stealing from the company. When this deal falls apart, and it will, you'll need to be standing on the right side. I built this company. My name is on every patent. My signature is on every founding document. Terrence Sterling is going to prison. The only question is whether you go down with him or you come home. The first board member, a man named Robert Franklin, who'd been on the board for 12 years, looked at the evidence for 90 seconds and said, "What do you need me to do?" The second, a woman named Patricia Simmons, took longer. She looked at the documents, then at Imani, and said, "I should have known. I watched him present your algorithm last quarter, and he couldn't answer a single follow-up question. I'm sorry, Imani." The third, a man named David Chen, who Imani had never fully trusted, said he needed to think about it. Imani told him she respected his process, and that all she asked was that he abstain from any board vote for the next 72 hours. He agreed. 3 meetings, 45 minutes total. The board was back. Piece 4. At 2 in the afternoon, Imani called Helen Calloway. "I need one more thing. Name it. The AV system at the gala. I need it controlled by our people. Not Terrence's assistant. Not the event coordinator. Our people. Already done. I called the venue this morning. My nephew runs the tech crew. He's the one who will be in the booth tomorrow night." Imani paused. "You called them this morning? Before I asked?" Helen's voice carried the faintest trace of a smile. "I've been waiting 10 years for you to take your company back. Imani, you think I wasn't going to have the projector ready?" At 2:30, Marcus arrived at Imani's 4th-floor office with a final review of every document, every legal filing, every piece of evidence. He spread it across her desk and went through it, item by item, checking and double-checking, because Marcus Webb did not leave things to chance. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at Imani with an expression she'd never seen from him before. Not his usual sarcasm, not his lawyer face, something else, something that looked like awe. "You put this together in 18 hours," I was said, "on no sleep, after crying on your office floor, while a social worker was evaluating your fitness as a mother." "I also made Zoe star-shaped pancakes this morning," Imani said. Marcus shook his head slowly. "You're terrifying. You know that, right?" Imani looked at him, at her oldest friend, at the man who'd kept a binder labeled "I told you so" for 6 years, because he loved her enough to prepare for the worst while she hoped for the best. "Thank you, Marcus." "For what?" "For always being there. For the binder, for answering the phone at 4 in the morning, for all of it." Marcus straightened his tie, which was his way of handling emotion. "You can thank me after tomorrow. Right now, we have a gala to destroy." "We're not destroying anything. We're reclaiming it." Same thing, better branding. That evening, Imani went home. She made dinner. She helped Zoe with her homework. She gave her daughter a bath and read her a story and tucked her into bed with Professor Bunny. "Mommy, are you going to the party tomorrow?" "Yes, baby." "Are you going to wear a pretty dress?" Imani thought about the dress she'd already chosen, not the emerald gown she'd originally planned, not armor, something simpler, something real. "I'm going to wear a black dress," she said. "Black is boring, Mommy." "Maybe, but sometimes boring is powerful." Zoe considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old philosopher, like how Professor Bunny is just gray, but he's the bravest bunny in the whole world. Exactly like that. Zoe smiled, satisfied, and closed her eyes. Imani watched her daughter sleep for a long time. Then she went to her own room, set her alarm for 5 in the morning, and laid in the dark, running through the plan one more time. Every piece was in place. Every contingency accounted for. 18 hours of work compressed into a strategy that was about to unfold in front of 700 people. Tomorrow night, the world would find out who really built Sterling Global. And for the first time in 10 years, Imani wasn't afraid. The Grand Meridian Hotel ballroom looked like someone had dipped it in gold and shaken it until it sparkled. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across 700 faces. Champagne flutes caught and released tiny stars. The air smelled like expensive flowers and ambition. Sterling Global's 15th anniversary gala was the kind of event that made people feel important just for being invited. Executives in suits that cost more than cars. Investors with handshakes that felt like contracts. Employees dressed in clothes they'd bought specifically for tonight and would probably never wear again. A live band played something smooth and inoffensive near the far wall. Waitstaff moved through the crowd like ghosts carrying silver trays. Everything was polished and perfect and designed to communicate one message. This company is powerful. This company is successful. This company belongs to Terrence Sterling. Terrence arrived at 7:15 with Bianca on his arm. She wore a red dress that stopped conversations and started whispers. He wore confidence, like cologne, thick and impossible to ignore. They moved through the room together, shaking hands, accepting congratulations, performing the roles they'd assigned themselves in a story someone else had written. Lorraine and Shanice took their seats at a premium table near the stage, positioned for maximum visibility. Lorraine wore diamonds. Shanice wore an expression of bored superiority. They surveyed the room like queens examining their territory, and at 7:22, Imani Cole Sterling walked in through a side entrance. Simple black dress, hair pulled back, no jewelry except a thin silver bracelet she'd taken from a safe that morning, a bracelet she hadn't worn in 12 years because it had been too precious to risk. Her mother's bracelet, sterling silver, unbreakable. She carried her leather journal. She walked to a small table near the back of the room, close to the kitchen doors, and sat down. She folded her hands. She waited. Nobody noticed her. She'd counted on that. At 7:45, Lorraine and Shanice made their way to Imani's table. It was ritual at this point, a tradition of cruelty that they performed at every event. The way some families say grace before dinner. "Still here?" Lorraine said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I would have thought you'd have the dignity to stay home after everything." Shanice smirked. "Right? I mean, at some point you have to read the room." Imani looked up, and she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, just a small, quiet curve of her lips that contained something neither Lorraine nor Shanice had ever seen from her before. It contained certainty. Lorraine's smile faltered. "What are you smiling about?" "I'm just having a really good night, Lorraine." Something flickered behind Lorraine's eyes, not understanding, not yet. Just the animal instinct that something was different, that the prey had stopped running and turned around. Lorraine walked away. She didn't look back, but her steps were slightly faster than before. At 8 o'clock, Terrence passed Imani's table on his way to the stage. He leaned down, his mouth close to her ear, and delivered the same 3 words he'd been delivering in various forms for 10 years. "You're nothing." Imani looked up at him, at this man she'd loved and married and given everything. This man who wore her company like a suit, and her money like aftershave, and her trust like a disposable thing. "I know you believe that," she said. Terrence blinked. She'd never responded before. In 10 years of cruelty, she'd always just taken it, absorbed it, folded it into her silence, and carried it away. But tonight she spoke, and the words were so calm and so sure that for one brief moment, something in Terrence's chest contracted with a feeling he couldn't name. He shook it off and walked to the stage. The speech was vintage Terrence, polished, confident, full of first-person pronouns. 15 years ago, I had a vision. I built a team. I took risks that others wouldn't take. The word I appeared 23 times in a 12-minute speech. Imani counted. Then the announcement. Tonight, I am proud to officially promote Bianca Hayes to Vice President of Operations. Bianca represents the future of this company. Bianca glided onto the stage. Champagne was poured. Glasses clinked. The room applauded a promotion that required board approval from a man who had no authority to give it in a company he didn't own. Then Terrence added something that wasn't in his prepared remarks. Something Victor Ashford had instructed him to say just 3 hours earlier, believing the deal was still on track. And I'm thrilled to announce that Sterling Global is entering a strategic partnership with Ashford Technologies, a move that will position us as the dominant force in the industry for the next decade. The room buzzed. This was news. Big news. Victor Ashford stood from a VIP table near the front, raised his glass, and accepted the applause with the practiced grace of a man who was used to being celebrated. In the back of the room, Marcus, who'd been standing near the bar, nursing a ginger ale, pulled out his phone and texted Imani. He announced it publicly. The Ashford deal. Do we abort? Imani looked at the stage. At Terrence shaking Victor's hand. At Bianca beaming beside them. At Lorraine applauding like her son had just been crowned king. She texted back one word. No. Then she stood up. She didn't walk to the stage. She walked across the ballroom floor, weaving between tables with the kind of purposeful calm that made people unconsciously step aside. She walked directly to Victor Ashford's table, where he'd just sat back down after his moment on stage, and she sat in the empty chair across from him. Victor looked at her, processed her simple black dress, her calm expression, the leather journal she set on the table between them. Can I help you? Mr. Ashford, I'm the person who called you this morning about the embezzlement. Victor's expression shifted, not dramatically. He was too practiced for that. But something behind his eyes recalculated. I'm also the person who founded this company, Imani continued. I wrote the algorithm that became our core technology. I filed every patent. I built the infrastructure from a dorm room at MIT, and I control the trust that holds 100% of the voting shares. She slid a document across the table. The original articles of incorporation. Her signature, her name, dated 15 years ago, 3 years before Terrence Sterling knew she existed. The man on that stage just announced a partnership that he has no legal authority to make. You've been negotiating with someone who owns nothing, and you just endorsed that negotiation publicly, in front of 700 witnesses and at least 4 members of the press. Victor read the document. His jaw tightened. His fingers whitened on the edges of the paper. What do you want? He said. Walk away. Tonight, publicly, tell the room you've discovered irregularities in the proposed partnership and you're withdrawing. You never mention my name, and we pretend this conversation never happened. And if I don't? Imani leaned forward slightly. Then the SEC receives a very detailed anonymous report about your team purchasing Sterling Global stock based on insider information provided by Terrence Sterling over the past 4 months. That's securities fraud, Mr. Ashford. And it doesn't matter how many lawyers you have. The evidence is in the wire transfers. Victor stared at her. The silence between them lasted exactly 8 seconds, which is a long time when your entire financial empire is hanging in the balance. You've been planning this a long time, he said. Longer than you know. Victor stood up, buttoned his jacket, and walked toward the stage with the expression of a man cutting his losses. He took the microphone from a confused Terrence and spoke clearly into the silent room. I apologize for the premature announcement. After conducting additional review, Ashford Technologies is withdrawing from the proposed partnership effective immediately. We wish Sterling Global continued success." He set the microphone down and walked out of the ballroom. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a period at the end of a sentence. The room erupted in confused murmurs. Terence stood on the stage with his mouth open and nothing coming out. Bianca's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. Then the lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. People assumed it was part of the program, a video, a montage, something celebratory. The screen behind the stage lit up with the Sterling Global logo. Then it changed. A photograph. A young black woman, 22 years old, sitting in a dorm room surrounded by computer equipment and whiteboards covered in equations. The caption underneath, "Founder and CEO, Imani Cole Sterling." The room went so quiet, you could hear champagne bubbles popping. More images. Imani at 24, signing incorporation papers. Her signature, clear and bold. Imani at 26, shaking hands with their first major investor. Imani at 28, standing in front of the first Sterling Global office building. Every patent filing. Her name. Every founding document. Her signature. The trust structure. Her control. Then the financial evidence appeared. Wire transfers. Account numbers. Shell company documents. $4.2 million moved from Sterling Global accounts into Terence Sterling's personal account. Dates, amounts, authorization codes, and finally internal emails between Bianca Hayes and Terence Sterling, showing that Bianca had knowingly approved budget reallocations designed to cover the theft. She wasn't just his mistress. She was his accomplice. The room was silent, not the comfortable silence of an attentive audience. The airless silence of 700 people realizing they'd been lied to for a decade. Imani walked to the stage. She climbed the stairs. Each step echoed in the silence. She reached the microphone. Terence stood 3 feet away, his face the color of ash. Bianca was backing toward the edge of the stage, her red dress suddenly looking like a target instead of a statement. Imani took the microphone. Not from Terence. He wasn't holding it. She took it from the podium, the way you pick up something that belongs to you. 15 years ago, she said, and her voice was steady, not loud, not angry, just clear and true and absolutely final. I built this company in a dorm room at MIT. I was 22 years old. I had $47 in my checking account and an algorithm that I knew would change the world. She paused. The room was motionless. I named this company Sterling, not for prestige, not for a man, for my mother, Denise Cole. She was a janitor. She mopped floors at an elementary school for 23 years, and nobody ever asked her name. But she taught me that quiet strength moves mountains. She gave me a journal and told me to write down every dream. And she was right. Because every dream I wrote in this journal, I built. She held up the leather journal. Worn, faded, the most valuable object in the room. I gave my husband a title he didn't earn. I gave him a salary he didn't deserve. I gave him credit for work he didn't do. And I did it because I loved him, and because I believed that sharing my success was the same as sharing my life. She looked at Terence. I was wrong. You took everything I gave you and told me I was nothing. You whispered it in my ear tonight, in front of 700 people, like it was a fact. But I was never nothing, Terence. I was everything. I was the foundation, the vision, the code, the sacrifice. I was the woman who built a $65 billion company while you slept and stole and lied. She turned to the room. As of this moment, I am formally resuming my position as CEO of Sterling Global Innovations. Terrence Sterling, is removed as CFO pending criminal investigation for embezzlement. Bianca Hayes is terminated for cause. The board will convene tomorrow morning at 9 to address governance reforms. Terrence took a step forward. Imani, wait. You don't understand what you're... I understand everything, Terrence. She looked at him with an expression that held no anger, no hatred, just the exhausted clarity of a woman who was done. That was always the problem. You just never noticed. From the back of the room, Jason started clapping, the young analyst who'd always wondered about the quiet woman in the back row. He stood up and clapped, and the sound cut through the silence like a crack in ice. Then Danielle stood, then the table next to them, then the one across the aisle. Within 30 seconds, half the room was on its feet. Employees who'd watched Imani be invisible for years. Women who'd felt invisible in their own lives. People who'd been waiting, without knowing it, for this exact moment. The applause was thunderous. Lorraine's wine glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor. Shanice tried to record it on her phone, but her hands were trembling so violently the footage would be nothing but a blur. Bianca stumbled off the stage, her heel catching on a cable, her red dress snagging on a chair. She didn't look back. Security appeared at the edge of the stage. 2 men in dark suits who'd been briefed by Helen Calloway that afternoon. They escorted Terrence down the stairs and across the ballroom floor. He looked back once, searching for something in Imani's face. Forgiveness, maybe. Recognition. Some sign that the woman he'd married was still in there, still willing to be small so he could feel big. But Imani wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the room, at the faces of 700 people who were finally seeing her for the first time. She set the microphone down on the podium, picked up her leather journal, and walked off the stage with her head high and her mother's bracelet catching the light. The applause followed her all the way to the door. The aftermath moved fast. 2 weeks after the gala, Terrence Sterling was arrested at the apartment he'd been renting downtown, the modest one-bedroom that was all he could afford once the corporate credit card stopped working. The charge was embezzlement, $4.2 million, federal jurisdiction. His bail was set at $2 million, and the man who'd once told his wife she was nothing couldn't raise 20% of it. Lorraine sold her diamond necklace, the one she'd worn to every gala for the past 8 years, the one she'd bought with her son's money, which was really her daughter-in-law's money. It covered half the bail. A college friend of Terrence's covered the rest and then stopped returning his calls. Bianca Hayes was charged as an accessory to financial fraud. Her attorney negotiated a plea deal that kept her out of prison but barred her from working in the financial sector. She moved within a month, left Atlanta, left the industry, left the city where everyone knew her name and now wished they didn't. The last trace of her was a forwarding address in suburban Ohio and a LinkedIn profile that had been scrubbed of every mention of Sterling Global. Lorraine and Shanice received the eviction notice 10 days after the gala. 30 days to vacate the house that Imani had bought with her own money 7 years before she married Terrence. The house Lorraine had redecorated without permission. The house where Shanice had filmed Instagram stories mocking the woman who paid the mortgage. Lorraine tried calling Imani. The number went to an assistant who politely informed her that all communications should go through legal counsel. She tried calling Terrence, but Terrence wasn't answering anyone's calls. She tried calling the family attorney, who informed her that she had no legal standing to remain in a property she didn't own, had never owned, and had no lease agreement for. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment across town, the kind of place they used to drive past without seeing. Lorraine's social club stopped inviting her. The women at her charity luncheon, the ones who'd laughed at her jokes about Imani for years, suddenly had scheduling conflicts that never resolved. Shanice posted a series of bitter messages on social media about loyalty and family and how blood is thicker than water. They went viral, but not the way she intended. Someone had screenshotted her old posts, the ones where she mocked Imani's clothes, her cooking, her existence. The internet put them side by side. Shanice Sterling, before and after. Her follower count dropped from 45,000 to 800 in a week. The custody case was dismissed 3 weeks after the gala. The judge reviewed the evidence, the fabricated text messages, the conflict of interest with Terrence's original attorney, the criminal charges, and ruled decisively. Full custody to Imani. Terrence received supervised visitation every other weekend. He used it twice in the first 3 months. Then he stopped showing up. Zoe asked about it once. Daddy doesn't come to see me anymore. Imani put down the journal she'd been writing in and gave her daughter her full attention. I know, baby, and I'm sorry. Is it because of what happened at the party? Imani paused. She'd been careful about what Zoe knew, had shielded her from the news coverage, the legal proceedings, the ugly details. But children understand more than adults give them credit for, and Zoe understood that something big had shifted in her world. Your daddy made some choices that had consequences, Imani said carefully. And he's dealing with those consequences right now. It doesn't mean he doesn't love you. Does he? The question was simple. The answer wasn't. But Imani refused to lie to her daughter, and she refused to poison her against her father, no matter how much he deserved it. I think he does, in his way, but sometimes people get lost in their own mistakes, and they can't find their way back. That's not your fault. It's never your fault. Zoe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Robinson says that when someone hurts you, you can be sad and strong at the same time. Is that true? Mrs. Robinson is a very wise woman. She also says you should eat vegetables, and I don't think she's right about that, Imani laughed. A real laugh. The kind that fills a kitchen and makes the world feel inhabitable again. Sterling Global's stock dropped for exactly 1 week after the gala. The business press ran the story for 3 days, talking heads debating whether a company could survive the revelation that its public leader was a fraud. Analysts issued cautious advisories. 2 investors called Marcus to express concerns. Then Imani gave her first public interview as CEO. She sat across from a journalist at a major business publication. She wore a simple blazer, no makeup beyond the basics, her mother's silver bracelet on her wrist. And she told her story. Not with anger, not with bitterness, not with the dramatic flair that would have made for better television. She told it with the same quiet steadiness that had defined her entire life. She'd built the company. She had stepped back to support her husband. She'd watched him take credit and said nothing because she believed in patience and partnership and the hope that love could survive ego. When it became clear that it couldn't, she'd taken back what was hers. I'm not here to tear anyone down, she told the journalist. I'm here to build. That's all I've ever wanted to do. The interview went viral. Not because of the scandal, though the scandal helped. It went viral because millions of women read it and felt something crack open inside them. The quiet competence that gets overlooked. The credit given to others for work you did in the dark. The way silence gets mistaken for weakness and patience gets mistaken for passivity. Women shared it with the same 3 words, over and over, in texts and posts and emails. This is me. Sterling Global's stock recovered, then it climbed, then it hit an all-time high. Because the markets don't care about drama. They care about competence, and the woman who'd built a $65 billion company from a dorm room algorithm was more competent than anyone had realized. Imani restructured the board, promoted from within, choosing people who'd been loyal and hardworking and who'd never once thought to stab someone in the back for a corner office. She hired a president to handle daily operations, a brilliant woman named Sandra Mitchell, who'd been with the company for 11 years and had once told Imani, quietly, in the cafeteria, "I see you. I don't know what you're doing, but I see you." Sandra ran the company with fierce efficiency, freeing Imani to do what she did best: think, innovate, and build the next generation of technology that would keep Sterling Global ahead of the curve. Imani created a mentorship program for young women in technology. She funded it personally, not through the company's charitable foundation, not through a tax-deductible structure, but from her own accounts. Because Mama D hadn't mopped floors for 23 years so that her daughter could delegate generosity to an accountant. She established a scholarship in her mother's name. Full rides to college for young women from low-income backgrounds pursuing degrees in science and technology. The applications came in by the hundred. Each one was a girl with a dream and a family that believed education was the way out. Each one was Imani at 17, 6 months after the gala. On a Saturday morning in October, Imani drove to a small town in rural Georgia. She parked on a street she hadn't visited in years, next to a church she'd attended as a child, and walked through a cemetery she knew by heart. Her mother's headstone was simple: Denise Marie Cole, the dates, and underneath, a line that Imani had chosen herself: "Quiet strength moves mountains." She knelt in the grass. She placed her leather journal on the ground in front of the headstone, and she spoke. "I built them all, Mama. Every dream we wrote in this journal. The company, the technology, the life you wanted for me. I built it all." She traced her mother's name with her finger, feeling the cold stone beneath her skin. "I know you didn't get to see it. I know you left 3 weeks before we hit our first million, and that kills me every day. But I want you to know something. You're in every line of code I wrote, in every patent I filed, in every room I walked into and refused to be invisible." Her voice cracked. "Just once, just slightly. I named the company after your bracelet, Mama. Sterling Silver. You wore it every day of your life, and I wear it now. And every time I look at it, I hear your voice telling me to write my dreams down. So I did, and I built them, just like you said I would." She stayed for an hour, sitting in the grass, remembering Sunday dinners, homework at the kitchen table, the sound of her mother humming while she graded papers. The way Mama D would look at Imani's math homework and say, "Baby, I don't understand a word of this, but I know it's brilliant." When she stood to leave, she felt lighter, like she'd closed a circle, like the girl who'd left this town with a journal and a dream had finally come back to tell her mother that the dream came true. On her way to the car, a young woman approached. Couldn't have been more than 24. Business casual, leather portfolio, nervous, determined. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm so sorry to bother you. I saw your talk at the tech conference last month. I'm a developer, just starting out, and I just, She took a breath. "You showed us that we don't have to be the loudest in the room, that we can build things and claim them and not apologize for existing." Imani looked at this young woman and saw herself at 22, scared and brilliant and carrying a journal full of dreams that felt impossibly big. "You were always powerful," Imani said. "Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. Imani watched her go and thought about all the women sitting in back rows right now, in conference rooms and classrooms and kitchens and offices on the 4th floor. women who had built things and let others take credit, women who had stayed quiet because they thought that was the only option. She thought about her mother, who had mopped floors so that her daughter could write code, who had never seen a boardroom, but understood power better than anyone who'd ever sat in one. She drove home. Not to the mansion in Atlanta. She'd sold that house 2 months after the gala. Every trace of Lorraine's redecorating, every expensive fixture that had been chosen to impress people Imani didn't care about, gone. Home was a house on the coast of North Carolina now. Nothing extravagant. 3 bedrooms, a big porch, a view of the water, the kind of house where you could hear the ocean if you sat quiet enough. And Imani had gotten very good at sitting quiet. She arrived just as the sun was coming up. Zoe was already on the porch, wearing pajamas and a sweater that was 2 sizes too big, drawing in a small leather journal that Imani had given her for her 8th birthday. "Mommy, you're home." "I'm home, baby." They sat on the porch together, Imani with her coffee, Zoe with her journal, Professor Bunny, slightly more worn than before, one button eye replaced with a mismatched blue one, propped between them like a tiny guardian. "Mommy, I'm writing my dreams like Grandma Denise said." "Yeah? What did you write?" Zoe held up the journal. The handwriting was messy and enormous and beautiful. 5 words in purple marker that took up the entire page. "I want to be brave like my mom." Imani pulled her daughter into her arms and held her. Tears came, but not the kind she'd cried in bathroom stalls and on office floors and in the dark. These were the tears that come when something broken finally heals, when you've been holding your breath for 10 years and you finally let it out. She looked at the ocean, at the light breaking across the water, at her daughter's messy hair and gap-toothed grin, at the silver bracelet on her own wrist that caught the sunrise and threw it back like a quiet, unbreakable promise. Later that morning, after pancakes shaped like stars and a walk on the beach where Zoe collected exactly 14 seashells and named each one, Imani sat on the porch alone. She opened Mama D's journal, the one she'd carried for 20 years, the one that held every dream, every plan, every heartbreak, every triumph. She turned to the last page she'd written on, a single line, written the night before the gala, when she was still afraid, still unsure, still wondering and if patience was enough. "It's time." She crossed it out. And underneath, in handwriting that was steady and sure and carried the strength of a woman who'd mopped floors and a girl who'd dreamed in dorm rooms and a mother who'd built the whole world for her daughter, she wrote 4 words. It was always mine. She closed the journal, set it on the porch railing, leaned back in her chair. The ocean kept moving. The sun kept rising. Somewhere down the beach, Zoe was showing Professor Bunny the seashells and explaining to him, very seriously, which ones were the prettiest. And Imani sat there, on her porch, in her house wearing her mother's bracelet, living her own life, and finally allowed herself to rest. The truth had come to light, not with a shout, or a scream, or a dramatic confrontation, with a steady voice and a leather journal, and the kind of quiet strength that moves mountains. And it was enough. It was always enough. She just had to believe it. Closing disclaimer: this content was independently researched, developed, and manually edited by our creative team to deliver meaningful storytelling with real emotional value and life lessons. Every character, dialogue, and scene was carefully crafted to inspire, entertain, and remind our audience of the strength they already carry within them. Thank you for being part of this journey.